Welcome everyone to Location and Transportation, our first category in LEED. Location and Transportation, which is sometimes abbreviated LT, is the first category and rewards projects for thoughtful site selection. This includes credits that encourage compact development, alternative transportation, and connection with amenities such as restaurants and parks. The LT category is new to the Building Design and Construction rating system in LEED version 4, although many of these credits have roots in the previously more broad Sustainable Sites or SS category, which remains in LEED version 4, and we'll cover that later in the course. Location and Transportation begins with site selection and addresses how the project will fit into the existing community, leveraging existing resources such as alternative transportation or a bicycle network, while also giving back by way of providing services directly back to the same community. So here we see our credits of the category at a glance, and you'll notice that we have no prerequisites in this category. It's actually the only base category in LEED Building Design and Construction that doesn't have any prerequisites. So for this category, we focus just on the credits. Also, a quick point of orientation here. So we're going to see the same at a glance listing at the beginning of each category. And what we're going to look at here are the names of the credits. So that's what you see here on the left-hand side. And all of these, of course, are the LT credits. And then we have our rating system adaptations. We have new construction, abbreviated NC. And then continuing to the right, we have core and shell, schools, retail, data centers, warehouses and distribution centers, hospitality, healthcare. And then in the final column, what you see here is whether or not that individual credit qualifies or is eligible rather for exemplary performance. So in this category, we have 3 credits that would be eligible for that bonus point that we talked about in the introduction. And that includes high priority site, access to quality transit, and reduced parking footprint. So here we have our first credit in the category, and it is a doozy. So you'll notice at the top of the screen here, it shows how many points each credit is worth. And this one is actually as high as 20 points if you're talking about core and shell. It's 16 for the rest of the rating systems except for healthcare. Now our intent is to avoid development on inappropriate sites, to reduce vehicle miles traveled, to enhance livability and improve human health by encouraging daily physical activity. So we're trying to cover a lot of ground really with this intent. It does kind of touch on several elements that would be appropriate for consideration when looking at a project location. And the reason it's so broad is because this credit, it's mutually exclusive with all the other credits in the category. So to say that another way, if you pursue this credit for your LEED project, you'll have to forego all of the other location and transportation credits in the category. This credit looks specifically at buildings that are located within a certified LEED ND location. So we have the details here, and I also want to add that not every LEED ND program is actually eligible here. So under version 4, any certified plan or certified project will comply. So really any LEED version 4 LEED ND project neighborhood is going to comply here. Now under the previous versions of LEED ND, we have stage 2 or stage 3 only as compliant. So those stage 1 projects don't actually meet muster in the sense that they would not qualify here, they would not qualify the project for compliance with this credit. First of all, the project team needs to give preference to site locations located in a certified LEED ND location. Pretty straightforward. A neighborhood either is or isn't LEED ND certified. So it should be a relatively straightforward assessment from the project team and primarily the project owner whether or not the LEED ND neighborhood location makes sense for that project. We mentioned that some types of LEED ND certifications work, but those stage 1 LEED ND certifications from either the LEED ND Pilot or LEED 2009 do not comply. Now there's an interesting wrinkle to this. So say for example you're a project located in the certified, say version 4 LEED ND location. You're going to get less than the maximum number of points because as we saw on the table in the last slide, there are several thresholds, or there's really 4 thresholds here depending on the certification level of the LEED project. So if it's a silver location, it's going to receive less points, of course, than if it's a platinum location. What this means is that a project could locate in a LEED location and actually qualify for more points if they tallied up each of the individual other credits. This is because of the mutual exclusivity to this credit, so project teams would be well advised to weigh both options, even if they find themselves already in a LEED location. And here we have our first sample question of the category. Which of the following potential site locations would qualify the project for Location and Transportation Credit LEED for Neighborhood Development Location? And the answer is number 2, a land parcel within the LEED version 4 certified plan. Now keep in mind, projects need to be inside the LEED boundary and they need to be in a certified project to earn this credit. And here's our next credit, LT Credit Sensitive Land Protection. The intent here is to avoid the development of environmentally sensitive lands and reduce the environmental impact from the location of a building on a site. Now there's 2 ways to do this. The first option, and easily the simplest option in terms of complexity, would be to locate the project on previously developed land. Now we'll look at the definition of previously developed land here in just a moment, but really that is the very simple way to approach this. So project teams that have the ability to select their site based on LEED goals would certainly want to give preference there. Now option 2 looks at selecting a non-previously developed site, so one that has not seen substantial development, that doesn't meet any of the quote-unquote prohibited criteria. So those prohibited criteria are prime farmland, floodplains, habitat for threatened or endangered species, or that it's located within 100 feet of water bodies or 50 feet of wetlands. And those last 2 points, they do exempt minor improvements. So it could be that there's a walking path or that kind of thing that does approach those water bodies or wetlands, but your building footprint and any major improvements would need to be at least that far away. The important strategies to think about here really center around the site selection itself. So when the project is looking at the different site options, so say they've got 3 different sites they're choosing from, they really want to give preference to those sites that, first of all, either are previously developed, which, recall, is the simplest way by far to approach this credit, or project sites that don't have any of those prohibited criteria. Now, in addition to the site selection itself, it's also important to minimize the disruption to those environmentally sensitive areas. So while the building footprint is one way to think about it, we also look at the development footprint, which includes any additional hardscape that may not be building itself, or any compacted soils or that kind of thing due to the construction activity. Now again, the previously developed site really is the preference here. Now, when looking at a site, so even more broadly than this credit, take a look at how much disturbance is going to be required. So there may be some large machinery that needs to be on the site for any number of construction activities. So when that large machinery is on site, making sure that it is not compacting soils, for example, that's going to be one of several strategies that the general contractor is going to want to put into place to make sure that that sensitive land is well protected. Now, and the final consideration here really has to do with natural features and the existing wildlife. So doing an assessment of those natural elements and also a site survey to make sure that that the natural life on site is at least considered during the design process. We also see a really long list of responsible parties when thinking about this credit. So it of course starts with the owner. They, in almost all cases, have the final say in what land is going to be selected for a project. But then we start to expand the applicable team for this credit. So we have our landscape architect, and then we start to talk about some professions that aren't always involved on a building. So we have an ecologist. Now they're going to be critical when it looks at making sure that the existing flora and fauna on the site is considered properly during the design process. We also include environmental engineers and then any other local professionals that would have to do with, say, assessment of natural spaces or of habitat for threatened or endangered species, or really across the gamut here in terms of what the team needs to look at. Now here's that definition of previously developed. Previously developed means altered by paving, construction, and or land use that would typically have required regulatory permitting to have been initiated. Land that is not previously developed and landscapes altered by current or historical clearing or filling, agricultural or forestry use, or preserved natural area use are considered undeveloped land. The date of previously developed permit issuance constitutes the date of previously development, but permit issuance in itself does not constitute previous development. Now that last piece is perhaps a little verbose, but really what it's trying to stress here is that it's not the permit itself that determines whether or not it is a previously developed site. It's the actual activities that have taken place. A previously developed site is a site that prior to the project consisted of at least 75% previously developed land. So you can have a small undeveloped parcel on a larger development site and still qualify here as previously developed. And here's our question. To achieve LT credit sensitive land protection, which site can a project develop on? And our answer is number 1. A previously developed site that's 10 feet below the elevation, so the 100-year floodplain is defined by FEMA. However, it could literally say anything after previously developed site, because keep in mind, option 1 of this credit says a previously developed site is going to meet the requirements regardless of other factors. Our next credit is LT credit high priority site, where our intent is to encourage project location in areas with development constraints and promote the health of the surrounding area. Now there's 3 options to this credit, but option 2, as we'll see here in just a moment, has a lot of sub-options. So, really, there are several ways to approach this credit. The first option is to locate the project on an infill location in a historic district. So there are historic districts around certainly the US and globally, and a project locating in one of these automatically meets the credit requirements. Now option 2 looks at locating the project in one of the following several considerations. So we have the EPA National Priorities List, and then we have several federal zones and communities. So the Empowerment Zone, the Enterprise Community, or a Renewal Community. The last 3 here, or the last 2, are the low-income communities or those difficult development areas or qualified census tract areas. Now, any of these locations, again, automatically earns the project the points here. The one final thing I'll mention here is that we have a lot of projects located in the United States, and this list absolutely applies. However, a project locating in Europe would not necessarily, and certainly doesn't, have these same types of designations for different parcels that they may develop on. So you would instead look at the local equivalent program. Now here we see option 3, and this one's quite different. So this looks at locating the project on a brownfield site. So a brownfield site, actually we'll define that here in just a moment, but it's essentially a site that's contaminated. In addition to locating on a contaminated site, you also have to remediate that contamination. And now we'll hear from sustainability design expert Heather DeGrella as she discusses site selection.
I think the first thing you want to think about when selecting a building site is to first off do no harm. So if there's an ecosystem that's healthy, avoid building there. If there's a natural resource on site, avoid that. You want to avoid sensitive features like wetlands and avoid impeding natural water flows on a site. So that's what to avoid. So where can you build? If you have a gray field or a brown field, that's a perfect opportunity to not only not impact a green field, but to actually restore or repair something that's already been damaged by man. The soil on a gray field can actually be amended so that it helps with the natural infiltration of water on the site. It actually can serve as a better carbon sequestering system, which means that it can actually take in the CO2 emissions that are in the air and store them in the earth to actually counteract those emissions that we've been producing. And the third thing I would say to look for is look for urban and dense areas. These areas already have a lot of infrastructure like roads, utilities, sewage, so that you don't have to use resources or money to build those out to your sites. They also usually have a lot of access to walkable areas, to places you can bike, and to public transportation. And what that means is that your occupants have a choice. They don't have to get in the car and drive. It's healthier for them, it's healthier for the environment.
We have several strategies to think of here as well. So again, you're going to keep hearing this in this category, but during the site selection process, give preference to appropriate sites. So here we would want to focus on brownfield or any of those other types of high priority sites such as the Federal Empowerment Zone. There's also the opportunity to leverage local tax incentives, or local or federal tax incentives that can help the project team offset the cost of performing either the remediation, or maybe there's some costs associated with complying with some of the historic district design criteria. Either way, these development dollars help encourage project teams to make use of these high priority sites. Now, brownfield remediation really has, its benefits are twofold. So on one hand, you're reintroducing developable land into the pool of land that's being developed. So you're taking pressure off of greenfield spaces or undeveloped parcels by making these previously developed parcels that may have some soil contamination or other type of brownfield elements, you're bringing them back into the pool. The other benefit here is that there's a tangible environmental benefit on the site itself. So while it may have been inhabitable or uninhabitable by local wildlife, once this remediation takes place, maybe they can start to come back. We talked about exemplary performance. So the way that's approached on this credit is kind of unique. So projects need to meet either option 1 or 2. So they're either within that historic district, or they meet one of those several criteria under option 2, or, and in addition to that, to qualify for exemplary performance, they're also on a brownfield and do that remediation work. So if you're hitting it from both fronts, you're going to get that bonus point. So here's that definition of brownfield. Brownfield is real property or the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or possible presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. Here's our next question. Which of the following sites qualify as a high priority site for LEED? Now in this question, you're going to select 3 responses. Okay. Well, the correct answers here are 2, 4, and 5. So difficult development areas as defined by U.S. Housing and Urban Development, the Federal Empowerment Zone, and the infill location in a historic district. And our next credit is LT credit surrounding density and diverse uses. So we have a pretty lengthy intent here, which is to conserve land and protect farmland and wildlife habitat by encouraging development in areas with existing infrastructure, to promote walkability and transportation efficiency and reduce vehicle distance travel, to improve public health by encouraging daily physical activity. So not only is it a rather long intent, but it's actually trying to address 3 specific areas. Now there's 2 ways to approach the credit. The first is looking at the calculated density of your actual neighborhood. So depending on the density itself, and depending on whether you're a core and shell project or versus any of the other rating system adaptations in building, design, and construction, you'll qualify for a different number of points. Now there's 2 ways to look at this as well. So on one hand, you can look at a combined density in terms of square feet per acre. Pretty straightforward assessment, but does require knowledge of the floor areas of the surrounding buildings. The next option looks at separate residential and non-residential requirements. So on one hand, we have the dwelling units per acre, and those criteria are at 7 for 1 point and 12 for 2. And then we also have the non-residential FAR. And FAR stands for floor to area ratio. and represents a calculation based on the floor area divided by the land area. So by floor area, I'm referring to the constructed floor area. So if you had a 3-story building, then you would have a floor to area ratio where there are 3 floors of 3. What this means is that you need to be at least 50% developed at that first tier and 80% developed at the second tier. And that's assuming single-story development. So if you were 2-story development or 8-story development, that's going to be even a lower threshold. And the second option focuses specifically on diverse uses. Now, we'll look at what those are specifically here in a minute. But essentially the project needs to be within a half-mile walking distance of a sufficient number of publicly available diverse uses. The strategies to think about here is that during site selection, you want to give preference to urban sites with pedestrian access. So we have lots of projects that locate in urban cores. However, not all of them have adequate pedestrian access. Say they're adjacent to a freeway that does not have a safe and an efficient way for pedestrians to get across that barrier. So if there's no overpass or pedestrian pathway, they would, even if they're an 1/8 of a mile away, they aren't going to get to take credit for that diverse use unless there's that walking path. Now, another way to think about this is with the building as just one element of the larger fabric of the community. And thinking about the building's resources that can be extended to the community itself. This may include some shared spaces, maybe some publicly available, whether it's for free or whether the building owner charges money for maybe some meeting space or that kind of thing. There may be a ground floor retailer in a mixed-use development, so there's a lot of ways that the building can give back to the local community. Now, diverse uses, again, which we define on the next slide, and then we take a look at all the details here in a moment. You can take credit for one of those as located within the building itself. So the building itself maybe it's a grocery store. That certainly counts as a diverse use, although you could, if you're a mall, for example, and say you've got 10 shops in your small shopping center, you would still only get to count one of those. Now the final point here is that we do have different use types, and within each use type you can only count up to 2. So if you had 5 restaurants across the street, you would only get to count that as 2. And here's that definition for diverse use. A distinct, officially recognized business, nonprofit, civic, religious, or governmental organization, or dwelling units, or offices. It has a stationary postal address and is publicly available. It does not include automated facilities such as ATMs, vending machines, and touchscreens. So that's the technical definition, but here's what we actually mean. So here are the 5 different types of diverse uses. So we have food retail, community serving retail, services, civic and community facilities, and then community anchor uses. So you would get to count up to 2 buildings from within each of these 5 categories. And that's what gets you to your 4 to 7 or 8 or more diverse uses. And here we define walking distance. So walking distance means something very specific within LEED, and it's focused on the distance that a pedestrian must travel between origin and destination without obstruction in a safe and comfortable environment on a continuous network of sidewalks, all-weather surface footpaths, crosswalks, or equivalent pedestrian facilities. The walking distance must be drawn from an entrance that is accessible to all building users. And here's our question. Which of the following are considered diverse uses for development density and community connectivity? And our answer here is 1, 3, and 5. So the fire station, the hardware, and the museum. Now these other 2 are a little bit tricky, but I want to put this into perspective. So the key here is that the diverse use needs pedestrian access. So while a gas station or a drive-through coffee stand certainly can, and in many cases do, cater to non-driving customers. This may be a walk-up counter for the coffee shop, or maybe there's a convenience store that sells juices and such at the gas station. But based on what you're given in terms of information here, that is not made clear, and it can't be assumed. So we would see these three as the only eligible uses here that may count for this credit. Our next credit is LT credit, access to quality transit. And before we jump into the intent, I want to throw out a number for you. There's more than 1 billion cars in the world today. And by the middle of this century, there could be as many as 4 billion cars, as the growing middle class of countries around the world seek the freedom and status that car ownership appears to offer. Now, the intent here is to encourage development in locations shown to have multimodal transportation choices or otherwise reduced motor vehicle use, thereby reducing greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, and other environmental and public health harms associated with motor vehicle use. The requirements are well, there's a lot to them here, but let's just work through them. So, locating the project within a quarter-mile walking distance. Again, there's that walking distance. We're not talking within a quarter-mile radius. It definitely has to be quarter-mile or less by foot. Within a bus, streetcar, or ride-share stops, or within a half-mile of bus rapid transit stops. Now, what that really means is that they expect building users would be willing to walk a quarter-mile to those rather more common types of public transportation options. So the streetcar, ride-share stops, etc. Now, those high capacity or high velocity transportation options, such as the light or heavy rail stations or commuter rail or even a ferry, those it's assumed that a half-mile radius would be appropriate. So the station doesn't actually have to be done yet. So it can be planned and sited, and as long as it's funded and under construction by the date of the building being complete, and that it's going to be done within 2 years, you can go ahead and count it for this credit. Now the strategies here are, well, there's really 3 primary strategies. So the qualified transit routes really should be assessed and determine whether or not they're going to be eligible here. So not every single public transportation stop would necessarily meet these requirements. First of all, it needs paired route service. So I know in my part of the world they typically have paired route service offerings, but it's not always the case that there would be a stop for each of those paired routes within the appropriate walking distance. Now, but basically it means that it picks up on that route going in each direction. However, you would only count trips in one direction because we're talking about the same bus line. Now, projects that are served by multiple routes need to ensure that no more than 60% of the required transit ridership is provided by a single route. So really what this means is that all projects are going to need at least 2 routes, and no single route can count for more than 60% of those required rides. Now, there is a workaround. So say that the transit service is redirected, maybe due to construction of your actual building. So that's totally fine, and as long as it's put back into place within 2 years, and as long as the frequency and available seats on those transit options don't decrease. Here's a common strategy to quickly locate any potentially eligible stops within a half-mile or a quarter-mile walking distance. So now what you're seeing here is not a walking distance map. This is a literal radius. So this alone would not confirm that that transit stop was within the acceptable walking distance. However, it's empirically true that anything outside this radius would never be walkable within that appropriate distance. So you can focus only on those stops that are located within the quarter-mile or half-mile radius around the project, and then do a walkability assessment to determine if there is an acceptable route that a pedestrian could take that's no more than a quarter or a half mile. Here we see a mixed-use redevelopment near the heart of a city. Now, this project had been assessed, and there are multiple bus stops within the quarter-mile walking distance from the project main entrance. Now that's shown here as A on the map. The pedestrian paths to these bus stops do need to be walkable. So the project was assessing this, and you can see it's fairly small print, but on the left-hand side of your screen you see in yellow it says walking directions are in beta, use caution. This route may be missing sidewalks or pedestrian paths. Now that's an immediate red flag for the project team because these pedestrian pathways must be walkable. So if there was a section of roadway that the pedestrian was expected to walk along with traffic to get to their destination, that would be an unacceptable pathway. However, the project team was able to use some free online tools that allow you to view the project at street level here, and they could quickly identify that there is indeed a sidewalk in place, however, with the construction fencing on the other side. So they were able to dismiss this as a concern, and they were able to go on and satisfy the credit requirements. Here's our question. A project is planned for an urban site. Which of the following situations might qualify for access to quality transit? Okay, and the correct answer is a pedestrian accessible commuter train stop will be built half a mile away within 1 year of the project's completion. All right, so our next credit is LT Credit Bicycle Facilities, where the intent is to promote bicycling and transportation efficiency and reduce vehicle distance traveled, to improve public health by encouraging utilitarian and recreational physical activity. So there's two pieces to these requirements. The first has to do with a bicycle network. Now this requires that the project be within 200 yards of a bicycle network that connects to at least one of these three elements within no more than 3 miles by bike. So at least 10 diverse uses. We talked about those a minute ago. That's the same definition of diverse use, although you can count more than 2 in each category when you're looking at it here. Connect with a school or an employment center, and that's only if the project is more than half residential, or one of these high capacity transit stations, so the bus rapid transit stop or any of these other, it's the same distinction between those high capacity and more standard capacity transit options. The second half of the requirements has to do with bicycle storage and changing rooms. Now, this looks pretty complicated, but believe me when I say it's actually relatively straightforward. So we have two different types of spaces, and then case 3 really addresses the mixed use option and really says to combine the two. So for commercial or institutional projects, you need 3 things. So you need short-term bicycle parking for 2.5% of all peak visitors. You also need long-term bicycle parking for at least 5% of regular building occupants. Now, peak visitors and regular building occupants they're not necessarily the same number. In addition to that, you need 1 shower for the first 100 occupants, and then an additional shower for every additional 150. Now, keep in mind, if it's, would not be typical that the project would either accommodate exactly 100 occupants or any multiple of 150 along with that, so you're probably going to get a fractional need in terms of showers. LEED will always round to increase stringency. Now what that means is that, say you do your calculation, you've got 175 occupants. You look at that and you say, well, we calculate that and we need 1.5 showers. You can't actually do a fractional shower, so you need a whole number worth of showers, and LEED always says you have to round up. So that's relatively straightforward. But that's also true if you had 101 occupants. So even if you need less than your 1.01 or less showers, you'll still round that up to the nearest whole number. So even at 101 occupants, you would need 2 showers. Now for residential projects, there's just short-term and long-term bicycle parking needs. So they don't include a shower requirement. However, that's because within residential projects there are dwelling units, and dwelling units inherently have provisions for sanitation. So there is going to be a shower or similar facilities within the dwelling units of the residents. Now the difference here is in terms of long-term bicycle parking. So this still looks at regular building occupants, but instead of 5%, which would be the threshold for commercial or institutional projects, we're at a whopping 30%. And that recognizes that many of these residential tenants are typically all at their place of residence in the evening, and many of them are going to have bikes. So if you only had 5%, you'd probably have overflow. So 30% is what LEED is determined to be the right percentage there. First, you only get to count those trails or bike lanes if they are fully funded by the date of the certificate of occupancy. So basically they can't be pie in the sky, some point in the future bike trails or bike lanes. Ideally they would be complete, but you can take credit as long as they're scheduled and complete and will be completed within a year. Now the short-term and long-term bicycle parking, there's only one difference here, and it's a really subtle one. So for short-term parking, you need to be within 100 feet of any main entrance. For longer-term parking, you need to be within 100 feet of any functional entry. So it's a subtle difference, but an important one here in terms of bicycle storage. Now, we wouldn't want to take credit for a different building's bicycle parking. So say, for example, we had two buildings, one was doing LEED, one was not, and the new LEED building was building a bicycle parking unit, and it was going to share it between the two buildings. You would have to apportion some percentage of that bicycle parking to each building, and this just has to happen on paper. You wouldn't need to mark those spaces or anything, but you would need to apportion it out so that you're only taking credit for the spaces that will be used by the occupants of the LEED project. So here we have an example of a bike trail which is connected to a larger citywide network that connects to over 10 diverse uses within 3 miles cycling distance, and it comes right to the bike storage area. Now with all of that in mind, we can assess that this project does meet the requirements to be connected to a bicycle network. So with that in mind, if it also meets the number of spaces criteria, so whether it's residential, commercial, or mixed use, that it has sufficient parking, and if it has showers as required, it's going to meet this credit. And here's our question. Which of the following is true for bicycle storage for LEED? Okay, and the correct answer is number 4. The number of bike racks required is partially based on peak visitors. And that's true. Keep in mind, there's regular building users, which dictates the number of long-term bicycle parking spaces, but peak visitors is the number of users you would look at for the short-term bicycle parking. And now we're at LT credit reduced parking footprint, where our intent is to minimize the environmental harms associated with parking facilities, including automobile dependence, land consumption, and rainwater runoff. So there's 2 sets of these requirements here. So first of all, there are requirements that apply to all projects. So don't exceed the minimum code requirements for parking capacity. So in most jurisdictions, there's a minimum number of parking spaces that a given building will need to install to be permitted. Now, LEED is not saying don't install the code minimum. They are, however, saying don't install any more than you have to. In addition to that, the project team needs to calculate what's called the base ratio recommended by the Parking Consultants Council. Now, the base ratio it really adds up several different space use types in the building and comes to an aggregate number of parking spaces. Now, then you look at 2 different types of projects. So on one hand, we have projects that have not earned points under either LT credit surrounding density and diverse uses or under LT credit access to quality transit. These types of projects must take that base ratio, deduct 20%, and then that's their maximum number of parking spaces. Other types of projects, those that have earned 1 or more points under either LT credit surrounding density and diverse uses or LT credit access to quality transit, need to reduce that value further by 40%. And then finally, for all projects, there needs to be preferred parking for carpools or van pools equal to at least 5% of the total parking spaces. Now this does not apply if there's only on-street parking. And here's our strategies to think about. First of all, minimizing the parking area. That's pretty simple on paper, but there are a lot of competing needs when it comes to correctly sizing a parking facility for taking both into consideration the environmental needs, but also the business needs of the building. There are, in many cases, great opportunities to share both the cost and the burden of the parking facilities with the neighboring community. So in my downtown city center, there are several community, or they're private businesses, but they serve the entire neighborhood parking structures, and many of them are several stories. So while there's inherent challenges with those as well, they do help relieve the environmental burden. Now the credit calculations also need to include the existing as well as the new off-street parking that's leased or owned by the project. So this may actually be parking that's outside of the LEED project boundary. However, it is used regularly by those occupants. Now projects that share or pool parking do need to calculate what their share of the parking will be so that they can confirm whether or not they're over or under the LEED threshold. Now mixed-use projects, really it's pretty straightforward. You simply aggregate the amount of parking that would need to be used by each use within the building and then meet your reduction target based on whether you do or don't earn those other LT credits. The final point here is that you don't count parking for fleet vehicles unless they're used by employees for commuting. So here we look at a real-world example of a project that was determining whether or not they're meeting this requirement. So in this example we have 130 parking spaces, which is 25% fewer than the base ratio, with the project not earning LT credit access to quality transit or the other LT credit for diverse use. So what that means is that the project only needs to meet that initial 20% reduction. So the fact that it's 25% lower means that it does comply. Now the other piece of the credit really looks at those preferred parking spaces for car or van pool parking. Now 130 parking spaces, looking at 5% of that is 6.5. However, you'll recall we just talked about the fact that LEED will always round in terms of increased stringency, so that will round up to 7 parking spaces needed. Now, what that means is that the project has demonstrated that it's providing sufficient preferred parking and therefore is going to meet this credit. Now here's our question. Minimizing a project's parking lot would what? So select 2 answers, and we're going to take a quick moment to talk about this question once you have a moment to give your response. Okay. Well, the correct answers here are 3 and 4. Encourage carpooling and help reduce the quantity of stormwater runoff. Now, the reason I wanted to stop and talk about this question is it goes a little bit beyond simply recalling information about the LEED program. It's requiring that you as the exam taker will have to take the environmental impacts of reducing a parking lot and understand what that means on the ground. So encouraging carpooling. With fewer parking spaces, people would be have a greater incentive to carpool. I think that one's pretty straightforward. And then help reduce the quantity of stormwater runoff. Again, because we have a smaller parking lot, we have less hardscape, and therefore less potential for problematic quantities of stormwater. All right, and our last credit for the category, LT credit green vehicles. The intent is to reduce pollution by promoting alternatives to conventionally fueled automobiles. Now, there's several pieces to this requirement. So first of all, for all projects, 5% of the parking spaces need to be designated for green vehicles. And now these need to be spread out across the different types of parking. So if you had short and long-term parking, think airport, but even more on a more basic level, if there was employee parking and customer parking, for example, you would want to have 5% of each of those separate parking lots meeting or designated for green vehicles only. Now the definition of green vehicles looks at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. They publish an annual guide which rates the cars of that year on a scoring system. And cars that get 45 or better are what are considered green vehicles for LEED purposes. There's another way to approach this in that instead of designating those spaces, you'll provide a parking discount. And because what parking costs in any given jurisdiction can vary wildly. I know I lived in New England for a time, and parking was at quite a premium. However, here in the Northwest, it seems that unless you're downtown, you're probably parking for free. Now, the other requirement here is that you provide either an electrical vehicle charging station for 2% of parking spaces, or that there's a liquid gas or battery swapping facility that can serve at least 2% of the total parking spaces of the project. So in addition to those designated spaces, you need either electrical vehicle accommodation or other alternative fuel vehicle accommodation. And here's the strategies to think about. So I mentioned that strategy of discounting parking. It is required that you'll have signage at the entrance to the parking area. So anybody driving in there would be made aware that there is an incentive here to commute using a green vehicle. Providing these transportation amenities can actually be something that the project shares in terms of expense with its neighbors. So say that there's a series of inline retailers at an outdoor mall. Maybe 3 or 4 of those folks get together and decide, we want to put a battery swapping facility in here, or we want an EV car charging station. There are a lot of options there, but leveraging those costs across many businesses can help bring that down. Now, the last thing I'm going to mention here, and there's a few strategies that we don't touch on directly, but green fleet vehicles. So that is a terrific strategy because the building owner can ensure that they are receiving proper maintenance and that they continue to operate as efficiently as they're supposed to, but also that then they can be used for daily commuting by employees and could presumably see quite a lot of use. We talk about preferred parking for a number of these credits, but I wanted to take a quick moment to define it. Preferred parking is the parking spots closest to the main entrance of a building, exclusive of spaces designated for handicapped persons. For employee parking, it refers to the spots that are closest to the entrance used by employees. Here we see the same parking lot from the project we looked at just a few credits ago. Now, you'll recall that there's 130 parking spaces for this project. So using the same simple calculation we used on the previous example, we know that 5% of the green vehicle spaces is going to equal 7. Now this project happens to provide 7, so from a quantity standpoint, they are meeting the requirement. And our final question of the category: what would help encourage the use of green vehicles? Okay, and the answers are providing discounted parking for green vehicles and designated parking spaces near the entrance for green vehicles. Now these other 2 measures here, they may help reduce the environmental impacts associated with automobile use. However, I don't think there's anything in them that would push a building user from using a conventional vehicle towards using a green vehicle instead.